Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Joe Campbell, professor of philosophy in the School of Politics, Philosophy and Public Affairs at Washington State University. We're here today to talk about the Wiley Companion to Free Will, which he worked on with Dr. Mickelson and Dr. Alan White. And really excited because we're going to talk about free will today. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So kind of just a starting question, why free will? What got you interested in that?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Actually, there is an easy, relatively easy answer. So my first interest, I think, in philosophy was epistemology. And I was really taken by skeptical arguments. And I started out as a math major, so I'm very sort of formally oriented. And so I'm very interested in kind of, the structure of, and I still am interested in the structure of epistemological skeptical arguments. But I couldn't find anybody at the time. I was in graduate school at Arizona in the 1980s. And there were great epistemologists there, like Keith Lair and John Pollock was there and Alvin Goldman. And I actually studied on some level with all of them, but none of them wanted to work on skepticism. They all thought that the question of skepticism was just kind of ridiculous or unhelpful. They were all a little bit more practically minded. And then I just happened to be reading, in a seminar with Keith Lair, some work by Peter Van Inwagen, essay on free will, and a lot of those arguments, and then also stuff by John Morton Fisher, and a lot of those arguments had kind of structural similarities to the skeptical arguments. So, and, by this time I had been in graduate school for about 6 years or so. So I thought, well, I could just kind of take my, take my knowledge of epistemological skepticism and just apply it and work on the consequence argument and related arguments like that. And that's kind of what I've done since then. And that's got me into free will, and it sort of keeps me with free will. And I'm still interested in the connection between, arguments, skeptical arguments about free will, and also arguments about incompatibilism, which is a kind of skepticism, and their relation to epistemological arguments.
Thank you. A lot of fertile ground there. I mean, I love that you said, that's an easy question to answer, because I figured of all the questions you get today, that might be the only one, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, talk to us a little bit about, just so we can establish a framework, what is free will? And I understand there might be different camps. Maybe if you gave a couple different definitions, kind of the main camps of like what people hold about that.
Sure. Yeah. In contemporary times, and I might, this taxonomy might be a little unique, but it covers the same kind of standard ground or whatever. I can explain how it's unique if you want to know, but I think that I think all accounts of anything even close to deserving the name of free will fall back on just this concept, this ancient concept of, from Aristotle, of up to usness. That we think that things are up to us, and then the debate kind of plays out. I would frame it as those, and this applies to contemporary philosophers too, those who think that up to usness or sourcehood is all that is important. That as long as we're the source of our actions, then we have the potential for free will, or we have free will. And those who think that in order for an act to be up to a person, the person had to have been able to do otherwise. So this is where the ability to do otherwise, sort of leeway, classical views of free will come in. So the basic distinction, I think that most contemporary philosophers who have a view on free will think that we have free will, and a lot that think that we don't, either think that free will is just sourcehood, that a person acts freely, if and only if they're the proper source of their actions, and then that gets spelled out in a wide array of different ways, especially
yes,
in terms of contemporary compatibilists. And then, sort of more old school leeway views or classical views that in order for I would frame it as in order for an act to be, up to a person, the person had to have done otherwise. And then you could spell that out in a variety of different ways too. And then, and then there are in these two different camps, you do find both compatibilists, people who think that this notion of free will is compatible with determinism, and incompatibilists who think that it's not compatible. And even today, like I would classify myself as kind of a classical or leeway compatibilist, but it's not a very popular view anymore. Most compatibilists have kind of gone in the source direction. But, I don't know. Are we going to answer any philosophy questions? No. So, but why try to prove to somebody that like sourcehood is consistent with determinism? It seems clear that it is. The challenge is leeway, free will, And I also think that, if you could show that even leeway free will is compatible with determinism, then the odds that, that we have it and the reasons for thinking that we don't, I think increase. So, or go away, the odds that we have it increase, and reasons for thinking that we don't go away. But so that's those are the kind of general camps, and we could talk about things like Frankfurt cases, which sort of kind of cut the link between what matters about free will, which is, according to some people, most people, its connection to moral responsibility. It cuts that link between moral responsibility and the ability to do otherwise, which kind of gives rise to these source views and these source compatibilist views. So that's my basic take.
Yeah. So just a quick clarification: when you say leeway, is that the to do otherwise?
Yeah. So
Okay.
So Paraboom makes this distinction between leeway and source that I'm kind of leaning on there. Sometimes I use the word, classical, and sometimes it is used by others too. Classical free will is the same for leeway free will. There might be, I'm working on ways of thinking of, different kinds of leeway free will. And there is a view. It's not popular from a contemporary perspective, but I think it deserves a sort of relook. If you remember, like the discussion by Locke, so, Locke is sort of famous for just, critiquing the language of free will, just the concept of free will. Like Locke says, well, freedom is a power and the will is a power. So, a power can't have a power. Um,
Hmm.
and so, and the emphasis then, started um, coming on action, like that we have free will to the extent in which our actions are free in some kind of way. And this is where, the ability to do otherwise uh, becomes important too. But if you just think of it in that way, then to have a free will is to have a will. And there's a sense in which we have this, the way that Locke described it and others describe it, this basic capacity to either, we get these suggestions for action and we can either go along with them or we could resist them. This is a sort of basic fundamental power, kind of, we could call it, say, freedom of choice or whatever. And I think it's possible that there could be, a sort of, most contemporary views tend to move away from choice and move toward action, in part because of Locke's suggestions. That's sort of the irony. But I think if we kind of revisit that, I think Locke does sort of postulate the possibility of a kind of undeniable free choice. There's a difference between jumping in the pool and being pushed. And what
Right.
it is to have free will is to be a creature, about which that makes a difference. That difference holds or something. And part of me wants to sort of say that, and it's a very minimal power. It can't sort of do a lot with it. Um, I criticize some contemporary philosophers because I think that sometimes they maybe overly glorify free will, turn it into, when they think of it in terms of like autonomy. Um, it's a very robust concept. I think it's probably a concept that applies to few of us. I'm not sure I'm autonomous according to some of these. Yeah, but I don't I don't think that has much to do with the age-old question of whether or not I have free will. Whether I have this other kind of capacity, which is certainly honorable, worthy, interesting. It's a power, complex one, autonomy, different conceptions, but. Um, I think if you think in more, simpler terms, I think, you can make a better case for, for us having free will, which I do think is kind of important. I guess I'm kind of a Strassonian at heart, in the sense that I do think that our thoughts about freedom are kind of worked into the fabric of, how we think about things, how we think about human relations. I think it's a lot harder, if not impossible, to sort of do away with free will talk than some free will skeptics suggest that it is. And I also don't think that the arguments, the skeptical arguments, are as good as people tend to think that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Even as I'm listening to you, I wrote a paper on free will and determinism in high school. It was not a very good paper. I'll just be upfront about that. I didn't know,
The
but I
fact that you were
do.
thinking about it in high school is incredible.
So I had they had an anthology at the library of different essays. I think Inwagen might have been in it, but I remember reading. Yeah, as you're talking about autonomy, and I think what gets people's hackles up is this question of moral responsibility, right? So
Mhm.
when you are faced, because I read an address to prisoners in a Chicago jail, I think it's called, by B.F. Skinner,
Mm.
in which he basically says to them, "It's not your fault you're here. None of you. Like, we are all merely products of our environment." And I think that goes to your point about, like, free will is literally written into just our discourse. It's almost impossible to get rid of. Um, What do you think of that sentiment? This idea that we are not like not even morally responsible, not even responsible for our actions in that kind of sense.
Yeah, I think that I think it's interesting. Um, here's an interesting observation before I answer that is that about getting back to the comparison between like skeptical arguments, epistemological skeptical arguments, and kind of arguments for free will skepticism, because we're really in the terrain now talking about like the possibility of free will skepticism, which would also lead to skepticism about moral responsibility, especially on the way that most people just think of free will as whatever it is that we need, the freedom relevant condition, necessary for moral responsibility. Um, but most contemporary philosophers don't think that the epistemological skepticism argument is good. And there are very few people, even somebody like Barry Stroud, who comes off as a skeptic and writes supportive of skepticism, is not a skeptic. I heard on a podcast, I think Philosophy Bites podcast, where he said, "No, I'm not a skeptic. He's just sort of interested in trying to, present the position." But there are free will skeptics. And if these arguments are, and I do think that there are kind of similarities between the arguments, these skeptical arguments, if these arguments are indeed similar, it's interesting to me why, there are so many people who just have these attitudes about the epistemological arguments that they're nonsense, or that the challenge is to find out what's wrong with them. But the free will arguments, that there's really something, that you could say about it, or just,
Hmm.
the general attitude that people have about philosophy is, well, you can't answer anything in philosophy. But yet, when we turn to free will, there are so many people who feel like, well, no, you can answer quite a lot. You could tell that free will is incompatible with determinism. You could tell that we don't have free will according to some kinds of views. And I just find it really interesting. And if you look at the history of philosophy, of course, these attitudes change. There are times where epistemological skepticism is taken seriously and free will skepticism is not taken so seriously. I'm not sure what it says about the contemporary times, there. But there are just a slew of issues that you have to deal with, that come up. I mean, the one that comes up just foremost is just the issue of prison reform. If free will skepticism is true, it seems that in our legal system, this concept, Clarence Darrow, crime, its cause, and its treatment. He talks about the sense in which the concept of moral responsibility is embedded in our legal system. Something is criminal to the extent in which, it's not just something bad, but it's something that is that you intentionally do bad. So there's the characteristic of blameworthiness is kind of worked into criminality. So the idea that you could just separate, blame and the moral responsibility part, and then leave, the criminal our criminal justice system intact, that just seems, silly. But of course, there are a lot of people that are well on this, that are thinking about these kinds of issues, and then there's a whole class of free will skeptics, people like Dirk Pereboom and Greg Caruso. I'll call them hard indeterminists or whatever, who try to suggest that, well, maybe we can model the criminal justice system on cases of disease or whatever, where we have to incarcerate people with diseases so that it doesn't communicate. The quarantine model, I think it's sometimes called. I think that Paraboom calls it the incapacitation model. The idea is all we have to do is incapacitate certain kinds of criminals, and we could justify that for reasons of self-defense and stuff, and we don't have to get into the kind of retributivist justifications that lie behind moral responsibility. But the problem with the quarantine model, or actually, if you just think of it in terms of trying to justify, not in a retributive sense, but in a consequentialist sort of sense, if something goes wrong, the thing to do if you want to make the world the best place is just lock up the worst person that you know. You don't have to lock up the person that did it. The consequences are going to be better. So there's no connection even to the doing of the act on a kind of consequentialist view of punishment, or even if you're just thinking of sort of self-defense reasons for punishment. If just as in the case of quarantine, it's not people with the disease that you're justified in locking up. It's people that potentially have the disease that you're justified in locking up. I mean, there's a whole terrain that kind of gets opened up with this, and just the idea that it's going to be some sort of easy fix. But fundamentally, my problem with free will skepticism in this context is just, you could look at the prison population, you could point to people in the prison population, and it seems like they are being unfairly punished, either because they didn't do it, or because whatever, or maybe there are mitigating circumstances that were not taken into consideration, so the punishment is far too severe. But yet, what the free will skeptic has, when they look at the problem of contemporary punishment, is just this solution for everybody. Nobody deserves to be there. I want to say that some of them deserve to be there far less than others do. And I don't see how you can't really make those kinds of distinctions, which seem very intuitive, without something like this old-fashioned free will framework that we're used to. So I think we're giving up a lot more when we give up free will than people have a tendency to think.
That idea of what's being of mitigation, right? Like if you don't have free will, what's being mitigated, right?
Right. Yes, that's exactly right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, the concept of mitigation is meaningful. Like reasons for mitigation. I do believe that there are reasons for mitigation of punishment, but that can only be the case if there is free will. That's right. Yeah.
I did want to, just because you've touched on it briefly, and I think it's an interesting path I want to make sure we cover. Kind of what's the history of this problem, but then you also mentioned in your introduction to this volume about how it's feathering out into different disciplines, and so if you can kind of just in broad strokes, what is the history of this free will problem, and how is it becoming? Would it be fair to say that it's becoming more interdisciplinary? I mean, you mentioned prison reform, and it definitely feels like we are now straying into, you're at the School of Politics and Public Affairs. Like, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And, that is really interesting too, because this is something I would not have guessed when I was in graduate school studying free will, which is historically like the most armchair of of philosophical issues. And also, even philosophers are annoyed by promise of free will. Philosophers have the same attitude towards people who work on free will that non-philosophers have about philosophers. It's like, what are you talking? what are you doing? But it is in many ways a sort of paradigm of interdisciplinary work in philosophy, and also the paradigm of kind of work in the social sciences and even neuroscience is connected to free will.
Mm,
I think
right.
it has a lot to do with, I think, the growth of our understanding of the mind, and the growth of our interest in issues in philosophy of mind, like consciousness, other kinds of things like that. I think the free will, fits, comfortably sort of in that family of kind of issues from a kind of contemporary perspective. But you also asked a little about the history. My dissertation was called "The Logic of Freedom," and what I tried to do was sort of trace the various different problems of free will. Like, so in the beginning, back in Aristotle's time, there was like the sea battle argument or the Stoic master arguments, which were problems for what some people call it logical fatalism, or sort of yeah, I don't like the term logical fatalism because they're not really logical principles. They're going to be principles like bivalence, like propositions are either true or false. They only have two truth values. But that's not like a logical truth. It's not like, that is the consequence of a result of a truth table. It's a metalogical issue. It kind of goes into building the truth table or whatever. So
Right, right.
still, it's a kind of logical. It's a problem for free will, independent of any theses about the nature of the world, just in terms of our basic logical principles that we might use. And then we move on into the issue of divine foreknowledge and free will, and issues about religion, and then comes the Renaissance and Newtonian mechanics, and then we move on to the problem of free will and determinism. We have like worries about biology and free will, and so there's always this sort of issue, and I think I've always tried to wonder whether there's a core issue that sort of permeates through all of these problems, or
Mm,
whether they're separate, distinct problems. And people have different attitudes about this. So, John Martin Fisher, he thinks that they're separate problems. He thinks that some of them are a lot more worrisome than others, and it informs his kind of his view about free will. But then the other thing that's interesting, and I think that this next observation kind of really shows how it starts to open up. You could see the interdisciplinary nature of free will, though, in just what I've said so far. I mean,
right.
people that are interested in religion, interested in science, interested in logic, all of these things might be a threat to your free will. So, you could kind of come at an interest in free will from a variety of different directions, a variety of different kinds of worldviews. But then in contemporary times now, and I really have to thank my co-writer Kristen Mickelson for this observation that comes out in the introduction, but just the impact of luck on these thoughts, like how we can rethink a lot of these problems and newer problems just in terms of the concept of luck. So if you just think of luck as being whatever is beyond human control, and in the classic document, Moral Luck by Thomas Nagel, he talks about, 4 different kinds of luck. And actually, Kristen, in a paper of hers, she whittles it down. In her paper, Free Will, Self-Creation, and the Paradox of Moral Luck, she whittles it down to just 3 different kinds of luck. But so there's a kind of what she calls causal relational luck. And this is where the problem of free will and determinism comes in. So you can think of free will and determinism as a kind of as one manifestation of a problem of luck, a problem of causal luck. The past and the laws, if determinism is true, have an impact on everything, but we have no control over the past and the laws, so we have no control over anything. And then another way in which causality enters is, the classic cases of moral luck, drunk driver type cases. You have 2 people, they both had too much to drink, they're driving too fast. And in one case, a person steps right in front of the car, and they're guilty of manslaughter. In the other case, there's no harm, no explicit harm, at least. And so there's there's a kind of consequence of your behavior that you have no control over, or there might be circumstantial luck, circumstances about which you have no control, or constitutive luck, facts about your character, your constitution, that you were just born with, over which you have no control. And so then the question kind of arises, like when we ask, like, well, in all these sort of worries about free will, what's doing the work, and, if you think of the older problems, I mean, one attitude might be, well, the problems are not all the same. And what's really doing the work is causality. The determinism problem is just bad. And then you get, you go down this kind of like incompatibilist sort of path, thinking about it like that. But when you look at the diversity of issues that might come up in luck, the problem kind of changes. So, Mealy, I think he's sort of following on Van Inwagen in an argument where Van Inwagen's mind argument, he tries to show that free will is problematized even in the case of indeterminism, because we have what Mealy now calls present luck. Just the facts about the moment of decision are kind of set. Once we're making that decision, there's not a lot of like play that we can have. Most of the decisions that we make for reasons, and given the reasons, there's a sort of tendency for something to happen. And then if you go the libertarian route there, well, you can have these 2 different scenarios where, you in the actual world, you in the possible world, you have the exact same characteristics. Every single fact about you is the same, but you end up making these 2 different choices. And then, even the choice, the decision itself seems to be something that is lucky. And then Neil Levy he thinks if you combine the sort of worries that we have about constitutive luck with these worries that Mealy presents about present luck, then there's not really there's no free will. You could show that there's no free will in that case. And now we haven't talked about the truth or falsity of determinism in any of that conversation. So, one thing I think that's interesting I'm totally in sympathy with, that gets revealed with the move towards free will skepticism, is this idea that it was never determinism in the first place. It was always something else, right? Something more mysterious that was sort of robbing us of our free will or something. Levy calls himself a compatibilist, even though he's also a free will skeptic. He thinks we don't have any free will, but it's not because of determinism. It's possible that we could have free will, in a deterministic world. It's just we don't happen to have it in this world, but it's for other reasons, like really just reasons about our cognitive makeup, how we make decisions.
And maybe this is just going in a completely wrong direction. Even as you were talking about what does, when you talk about the causality problem, what role does our a capacity for self-reflection play into that? Our capacity for self-awareness, or I actually had it's a tangential, it's not exactly related to this discussion, but very similar in some ways, with Dr. Catherine Malibu on Kant's transcendental. So very similar in that way of this self-shaping ability. Of course, that's the kind of begging the question, is it really self-shaping? But how do you see our capacity for self-awareness or self-reflection? How does that figure into these discussions of causality?
Yeah. Boy, that's a good question. Now, let me just ask a question clarification first, but are you talking about maybe what Leibniz called apperception, our ability to kind of reflect on our conscious experiences or something? So for Leibniz, there are three stages of monads. The first stage, they just have perception, like input output. Then they have consciousness. Then they have apperception, which is sort of awareness of consciousness, self-conscious awareness, I guess. Is that what you're talking about, or no?
So I'm gonna say I think so. I'm pulling from Kant, and I'm sure, I know Kant uses apperception, and so I'm assuming he got it from Leibniz. But to say that Kant's idea of apperception is the same as Leibniz, I'm sure there's some twist that he did to it. But I think we're in the general ballpark. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that no, I think it's really relevant. I mean, it'd be hard to explain the various different ways in which. Now, one thing. So I had a sabbatical last year, and I actually have a draft of this book where I'm trying to, put some of these things together. But and while I was doing some research there, I came across this book by Michael Freda called "A Concept of Free Will," and so what he was interested in is, where did the concept of free will come from, and what is it? And he essentially argues, he thinks the concept of free will is kind of essentially connected to choice. So it doesn't exist for him in the time of Aristotle and Plato, and it doesn't come about until the Roman Stoics, like Epictetus, he thinks is the first. I think he's influenced by Cicero. But even Cicero doesn't quite have it. And it does get at this idea of, the power that I mentioned before, this power of choice that we have of sort of either going with the flow. Because, this is all working off a Stoic concept. For the Stoics, we're constantly being influenced to act. Like we're always receiving these kinds of this information instructing us to do certain kinds of things. And the only power that we have is, to go with it or to go against it, you know. Now, in the context of this time, which is right around the time of Christ, you have, or right after the time of Christ, you have these, three different, worldviews present. You've got these pagans, and you've got these Stoics, and you've got these Christians. But what they all share is a certain kind of fatalism, or a certain belief that things are fated. They're either fated by nature, or they're fated by God, or some combination of both in the case of the
Right.
Stoics. But so the worry was not a worry that we think of traditionally when we think of the problem of determinism. The worry wasn't about like whether or not we had the specific ability to do otherwise, that, given everything or whatever, we could have done one thing or another, because we don't have any control over the world. The world is completely controlled by forces outside of us. So what was the concern then? Well, the concern was whether or not we could flourish, given. So it was really a worry about, situational or circumstantial or constitutive luck, about, if we were born with certain handicaps, could we still flourish? And there are different conceptions of flourishing. For Christians means going to heaven, or it means something different for the Stoics and something different for the pagans. But the idea, so there's this, free will has always been connected with these, higher levels of freedom. Even when you think of it in terms of, when you move into a sort of political context, where you get this distinction between like negative freedoms, like our rights, or positive freedoms, positive liberties. You could think of autonomy or something like that is in the kind of positive kind of liberty camp. So, and I think, what I want to try to do, I think where free will should kind of move is kind of away from this sort of unnatural, incompatibilist, contra-causal sort of way of thinking of it, and just think of it in terms of developments of certain kinds of capacities. So you could think of like immoral action as a kind of imperfection. There's something that goes wrong, and in a sense, the imperfections might be caused by mitigating circumstances or something like that. But so if you think of just the capacity of self-reflection and developing on that, what you could do with that in terms of helping to give somebody more control over their life in a sort of, by reflecting on a variety of on the right kinds of things or whatever, and we all have our different stories about how to achieve flourishing or how to achieve autonomy or something. There are a variety of different, stories that are sort of that are kind of out there. But I think that they all concern, the concern is not developing some kind of ability to act contra-causally. The concern is with developing the right kinds of capacities, developing the right kinds of dispositions, and other things like that. When I was listening to this, I mentioned before, I'm listening to Clarence Darrow on crime, its cause and its treatment, and he's really advocating the idea that we start treating criminals like criminality is a disease. He says crime has a cause. There are reasons why people partake in criminal behavior. And if we have a prison system, it should work towards, like, in the same way that hospitals work towards trying to end disease. Right. It should work towards trying to end crime, but that's not how the prison system works. And it's getting even worse because now prison has these, financial incentives. It's gone, it's been privatized. So, but yeah, so I think the key towards, freedom and also developing the kind of, character that's conducive to moral and responsive behavior is in, the developing of capacities in some sense. And we have the technical wherewithal now to figure out, what the important capacities are and also how to develop them.
Are we in the realm of virtue here? Because it almost sounds, I mean, if we talk about in free will terms, the idea that a lot of times we're concerned about moral choices and we make these snap reactions, right? And it doesn't feel free. It feels like it's just conditioned into us. If something happens really fast and we respond morally. And Aristotle's kind of reaction to that is that, a lot of the morality is the building of habits. So it wasn't then that you made that choice. It was what kind of character you built up to that point. And so as you talk about developing these capacities, are we talking in some ways about, not that I understand there's some difference between capacity and virtue, but it seems like there is kind of at least a tenuous thread between that development. Am I tracking with that?
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly a connection there. And of course, with something like virtue theory, there are a lot of different ways in which it could go. I mean, one problem, and this criticism comes up in the Freda book, where he's sort of tracking the concept of free will, and he claims that Aristotle doesn't have the concept of free will, and part of the reason is because the thing is that he doesn't care about that issue that the Stoics cared about, and also that we kind of care about in contemporary times, that the libertarian clearly cares about, whether or not we have the specific ability to do otherwise. Meaning, at a time, given all the facts of that, to fix all the facts and the laws at that time, could we have done one thing or another, which requires a kind of contra-causal, what I would still call a kind of contra-causal freedom. I don't think that, because, once you, once you get after a while for Aristotle, you're just locked in. You are your virtues. Your actions are just a consequence of your virtues or vices. There's really not much that you could do, about that. And so, and my own feeling, and this maybe this reveals too much about my personality. It's sort of an indication of like how, I don't know, I just look at myself, my life. I'm just not a virtuous person. I do the wrong thing all the time. I haven't developed the best of habits. I should be doing things that I'm not doing. I just feel, but yet I feel like, I still have a chance or something. There's still sort of hope or something like that, So I think that, like, that idea of, there's always chance for improvement, you know.
Right.
One thing I'm struck by with respect to contemporary prison, because I did a little bit of research. I worked on a project related to this a while back, and I did a little bit of research on different programs that they have in prison. So, and there are a variety of them, and there are programs, you know, where the prisoners get to do art. There are even programs where prisoners just hang art on the wall, you know, or programs
Hmm.
where they work with plants, and programs where they kind of get into the, you know, the science of it too, so they are able to learn some skills and stuff. There are obviously education programs and various, you can get degrees, you can take classes. Here's the thing, every single one that I found out about, the recidivism rate was lower in each
Right.
case. In each case, you know, I just think the idea of, you know, I mean, it's one thing as to whether or not punishment is, you know, a deterrent to future crime or something. But what, you know, what would the opposite of deterrent be? You know, like what if punishment actually causes future crime, which it does,
Mm.
right? Because the
Yeah.
chances of going back to prison once you get in are a lot better than they
Yeah.
were before you got in. Okay, that's problematic. I mean, we're not taking into account what the causes are of these things. And I think part of that is because we have this conception of human action that it's contra causal, that if we think of it as having causes, then we're jeopardizing it or something. You know, but that is certainly locked into the idea that whatever the threats to free will are, determinism is among them. And I think that, you know, I think we have reason to think, no, it's not determinism. We don't really know exactly what it is, but whatever it is, whatever these threats are, determinism doesn't seem to be, you know, the right one. You know, and you know, it leaves open the possibility, and this is, you know, this is what I'm exploring in this, you know, in this book I'm working on now, that there might be some logical core to all of these problems, some sort of, you know, basic, you know, core set of assumptions that you know, just keep popping up when we reflect on these issues. You know,
Well, it
um,
sounds like I need to have you back. That's what it sounds like. But the that because that's a fascinating idea, and if you can bring it to that, that's um it's a very slippery, and even as you've mentioned multiple times, there are multiple issues. There does seem to be some thread through all of them, but what that is, uh very difficult to untangle. But forgive me for kind of butting in here, but I did. Yeah, you mentioned it at the very beginning, and it has been stuck in my notes because I really want to hear this. What are Frankfurt cases?
oh, okay, yeah. So, and these are, I think, really important, and they fit into the, you know, discussion these problems in a wide array of ways. But just to give some backup, so like the uh, Frankfurt cases came out in a paper by Harry Frankfurt in 1969. So it was a while ago, and they are kind of in the free will literature, sort of what the Gettier cases are in epistemology, which I think also came out in 1969, if I'm not mistaken. But
It
around
was
the,
the year
the,
for
the
that, apparently.
yeah, so they, and so it's, but the setup is that at the time was this kind of, you know, classical conception of free will and moral responsibility, this idea that free will required the specific ability to do otherwise, and that free will was necessary for moral responsibility. So the specific ability to do otherwise is necessary for moral responsibility. And so the Frankfurt cases present a challenge to this idea. And the way that they go is you set up a case in which somebody has the potential of being manipulated, but they're not actually manipulated. So suppose that you got Jones and Black. I think these are names that are from the from the Frankfurt case, but I'm not going to use that actual example. But it's something like that. Suppose that Jones and Black conspire to do a bank robbery, and Black, who happens to be a neuroscientist, is not sure that Jones is going to go through with it. So to ensure this, he has this device implanted in Jones's brain, and the device works in this way. And this is from an example by Paraboom, that if Jones is going to back out of the plan, he would engage in some moral reasoning, say. And the device would, measure or register the moral reasoning, and then it would click in and turn him into a robot, and he would just against his will rob the bank. As it turns out, Jones goes along willfully. Okay. So it seems, since it was an action caused by his own, willful actions, it seems that Jones is morally responsible, but yet he couldn't have done otherwise. He would have robbed the bank either way.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So, and now, I will point out, this is a paper I'm working on right now, so it's not something I have in print, but I do think that this, if you think of like just this conception of free choice as sort of doing something willfully or resisting, that power is still there in the Frankfurt case. He can resist. I mean, that's part of the setup, is that he can decide to engage in moral reasoning, and that will, make it so that he's not the, responsible for it. That would certainly be a mitigating circumstance. So even though he has no control over which action he does have kind of an element of control over whether he's blameworthy for that action or not. Like if he knew the device was implanted and he couldn't bring himself to actually do it, he would just let the device, take over, and he'd be out of it or something. He wouldn't be blamed for it. So even though, the action is sort of set in stone, whether the action is blameworthy or not seems to still be up for grabs. It's part of the it's built into the example. So,
right.
But in any event, I mean, this, I've given other kinds of responses to this, and most people still think that these Frankfurt cases, and of course you can change them, you can make them more elaborate, and most people are quite persuaded by these Frankfurt cases, and that's a big reason toward why I would say that most contemporary philosophers are kind of on the source view. They go away from leeway view, specific ability to do otherwise as being relevant, and move towards the source view.
Because it's the question is whether it's up to Jones, not whether he could have done otherwise.
Right. Yeah. So a popular version of this is by Carolina Soturio. And she, I think she calls it and it is inspired by the work of Fisher, but she calls it an actual sequence, thing. And so the general idea is that alternative possibilities aren't sort of relevant to the kind of freedom and more responsibility characteristics or whatever the action. But I don't know. I think it's all. I don't know. I'm not completely convinced. I've never been completely convinced by these Frankfurt examples, but they do present a challenge about and also the other exciting thing is I do favorably look toward the leeway free will. I'm favorably inclined to think of that. But again, philosophy, what do we know? And it really has opened up. These source views are interesting. I mean, they've opened up a wide array of avenues of sort of looking at free will. And by its very nature, because it's not wedded to leeway free will, by its very nature, it doesn't have the same kinds of problems that these leeway views have. Of course, if again these problems are caused by something deeper, maybe it does have these problems. They're just harder to reveal in that case, which is my suspicion. But still, the fact that the problems are not on the surface allows people to sort of explore a lot of different avenues of these kinds of questions and these issues, and these are avenues that wouldn't have been open had it not been for Frankfurt and the work of Fisher too.
Yeah, Dr. Campbell, let me say thank you so much for coming on the show. If you could leave our audience with one takeaway, not necessarily a summary of everything, because I think that that's not a fair question, but what's a takeaway you would leave for our audience today as they think more about what we've talked about today?
I think that there have been a lot of really positive movements in free will research that are exciting and that will make it continue to be an exciting and important area. And I think they're connected to a lot of the things that we were talking about, both the idea that problems about free will are kind of related to these issues of luck, and luck is just things that are beyond human control. And there's a lot more that is potentially beyond human control than what comes out in these classic stories, whether we think of the religious ones or the scientific ones, but these determinism, predeterminism sort of related stories. And but in challenging free will in this wider array of rays that we have right now, we also have the opportunities, and we have a lot more resources too, to develop responses to these particular problems. And the problems are less general; they're more particularized. Like about the constitution of particular agents. What do we do about the fact that people are born with a certain kind of constitution? Does that lead to mitigating, factors in these considerations sort of from the get-go? See, that's what I want to say ultimately, is that, whether the arguments work or not, whether they extinguish, the concept of free will, there's still this, we have this, this power of of resisting or going along with the flow, or resisting. And you could look at history of people who put that power to great work. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
I think that's a great way to end what we've been talking about. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you.